There's a concept in Japanese culture that describes a situation where people vanish without a trace, seemingly taken away by an unseen force, leaving no sign of what happened. This concept is known as Kamikakushi. Kami refers to spiritual beings or forces, and kakushi means hidden or concealed. In ancient times, people believed that when someone disappeared mysteriously, it was due to the gods or spirits of nature, forests, mountains, and rivers, intervening. Sometimes, the missing person would return, unharmed, only to vanish again, while other times they would be found, but no one could explain their fate. Most often, however, they are never found again, and their disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. While this idea was made famous by Studio Ghibli in the film Spirited Away, the history behind these disappearances is much more unsettling. I want to share with you a story my grandfather told me when I visited him in his final years at the hospice. He had spent his youth in a small rural village in Japan, and it was during one of my last visits that he opened up about an experience that haunted him for years. I'm posting this in the hopes that someone out there, who may have encountered something similar, can help shed light on this mystery. It's something that stayed with my grandpa, and I've spent years wondering if there's a deeper explanation. I don't know the exact date it happened, as my grandfather couldn't remember the details clearly in his later years. But from the context of his story and what my grandmother told me, it was sometime in the late 1950s. He lived in a small village, one of many in a rural region, where boundaries between communities were often unclear. The people in these villages didn't just follow mainstream Shinto traditions, but also had their own unique spiritual practices. They often invited different deities into their homes for protection, a blend of local beliefs that included influences from various cultures. At that time, many young men had begun leaving for the cities, Tokyo and other big urban areas, seeking better opportunities, and the economy was thriving. Change was in the air, and everyone was excited about the future. But one day, without any warning, a boy from a neighboring village disappeared. My grandfather recalled hearing the news when it spread to his village that evening. He remembered feeling uneasy, especially given the timing. The boy had vanished at dusk, a time known as Omagatoki, the hour of twilight. This was believed to be a time when the veil between the human world and the unseen realm was at its thinnest. It was said that at this hour, the boundary between what could be seen and what was hidden was unclear, and strange occurrences were more likely. There's an ancient term in Japanese, Kamikakushi, which describes the mysterious disappearance of people without a trace. It translates to hidden by the gods, with kami meaning god, and kakushi meaning hidden away. In traditional belief, when someone vanishes without explanation, it's said that the gods of the mountains, rivers, or forests took them. Sometimes, these individuals return unharmed, sometimes they're found dead, and in many cases, they never return at all. This concept of vanishing was popularized by Studio Ghibli in their beloved animated film Spirited Away, but the origins and real-life implications behind the term are far darker and unsettling. I want to share a story passed down from my grandfather, who spent his youth in a small rural village in Japan. It was something he spoke of in his final years, and even though I don't know all the details, I feel it's important to tell it, especially for anyone who has experienced something similar. I don't know the exact year, but judging by the details, I think it must have been around the late 1950s. The village was one of many in a cluster, so much so that it was hard to know how many distinct villages there really were. To an outsider, they all blended into one. People in the village followed old traditions, but their worship wasn't of the common Shinto gods. It was something else, something more ancient. They would bring home small statues of deities from various cultures, not necessarily for spiritual reasons, but more as a way to invite luck or protection. My grandfather often spoke of how many of the men had left the village in search of better opportunities in big cities like Tokyo. The village was changing, people were looking forward to a more modern urban life, and big changes seemed to be on the horizon. Then, on one ordinary day, something strange happened. A boy from a neighboring village disappeared. It was late in the day, just after dusk, when the news reached their village. My grandfather always recalled how unsettling the timing was. He was deeply disturbed by it. The boy had gone missing at Omagatoki Morsi, which translates to the time of meeting demons. It was believed that this twilight hour was when the barriers between the worlds thinned, and the spirits or creatures of the underworld could cross into the realm of the living. For my grandfather, it all began with his neighbors. He and the neighbor's child had been friends since they were little boys. The day before the incident, they were playing near home, knowing they had to be inside before sundown. As the sky shifted to a fiery orange and the sun turned a deep red, my grandpa felt it was time to head home. That's when he saw something unusual, a humanoid figure, or perhaps it was more like a presence, appearing on the horizon. It was hard to make out exactly what it was because the setting sun cast everything in a warm, blinding hue, but my grandpa clearly saw that this being had multiple arms, more than a human should have. The arms hung loosely at its sides as it moved across the gravel road, almost hovering, until it disappeared into the orange haze next to the fence outside his friend's house. At the time, he didn't understand the significance of what he'd seen. He just acted as though it was a normal evening, telling his friend that it was time for him to go home. They made plans to meet the next day and go fishing at a nearby creek. The following morning, my grandpa came out to find his parents at the neighbor's house. His family was told that the neighbors had mysteriously disappeared. The whole family, his friend, his parents, and even his siblings, were gone. My grandpa remembered his dad remarking how odd it was that they left without a word, as the two families had been very close. His mother, my great-grandmother, became visibly upset and said she would pray at the family shrine and offer food to the gods in the hopes of their safe return. Later that year, my grandpa's family moved to Tokyo, and eventually they emigrated to the United States, where he met my grandmother. It wasn't until much later in life that my grandpa realized the true meaning of what he had witnessed that day, and the strange disappearances that had been happening in his village. He told me that the deities they worshipped weren't traditional gods, but rather beings of a more ambiguous and unsettling nature. These were not gods bound by any moral or divine rules. They were powerful forces with their own desires. These deities had grown accustomed to the offerings made by the villagers and didn't want people to leave. Kamikakushi, or mysterious disappearances, was their way of keeping people in the village, ensuring that the incense never went out and that their offerings were always replenished. The cluster of villages where this had all taken place is long gone now, replaced by small towns and new developments. People who stayed behind now live peaceful, rustic lives, but no one knows what happened to the families who left back in the days. My grandpa considered reaching out to someone back home to ask about the vanished families, but he never did. I don't know if he was afraid of what he would find, or if he didn't want to hear that those people had vanished too. If anyone has had a similar experience, or if you've heard of stories like this from your own family or community, I urge you to contact me. I've been researching Kamikakushi in modern times. There have been many documented cases, and while some may be urban legends, I'm always searching for personal stories and accounts. Every summer, without fail, my mother would take my sisters and me to Japan to visit my grandmother and aunt. It was always a fun time there, and I looked forward to it every year. I had lots of friends, and I had much more freedom compared to my life in America. My sisters, friends, and I would stay out late, visiting various shops or racing down empty streets on our bikes. I really miss those carefree days, if I'm being honest. But sometimes we would cut it close to curfew, and that meant we had to find shortcuts to get home. My grandmother's house was in a small town, and there were two ways to get back. The longer, safer way was along a busy street, where there were always people around. Nothing could happen there without someone noticing. Then there was the shortcut, which passed by an old cemetery. Japanese cemeteries are different from those in other countries. They're usually smaller, and the graves are not traditional burials. Instead, the ashes and bones of the deceased are kept in small stone monuments that families can visit. My grandfather's monument was located in that cemetery. At the base, there was a heavy rock that could be moved to reveal a small space where the ashes and bones were kept. Naturally, my friends and I knew the local stories about the cemetery. Every child had heard these urban legends. I knew them too. The idea of walking through a graveyard at night was not appealing to my friends or my sisters, who preferred the safer, longer route. But I was not going to be late coming home, not after my mother had already warned me. Come on, stop being scared. What's scarier than getting caught by our moms when we're late? I teased them, but my sisters, who were easily frightened, and my superstitious friends refused to go with me. I should have listened. I should have taken their advice and avoided the shortcut. But after teasing them, I couldn't back out. So we split up. I took the shortcut, and my sisters and friends went the longer way. At first, everything was fine. Sure, seeing some of the older, crumbling tombstones made me uneasy, and there was no light except from the small lamp on my bike. I wasn't riding it, as the sidewalk was too bumpy and cracked. So I walked beside my bike, trying to stay steady. It's that feeling you get when you're alone and you start thinking about all the scary stories you've heard. The sense of dread slowly creeps in, even though you can't explain why. Some say it's just your imagination, but for me, it felt like something bad was about to happen. Yet, at the same time, I was terrified to run. Something in the graveyard seemed to watch me, and I feared that if I made a move, whatever it was might chase me. I was walking through the graveyard, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare, all alone at night. I could see the exit now, and it brought a brief sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. As soon as I thought about jogging to the exit, I heard something, an odd rustling, dragging sound. It came from somewhere behind me. I don't know why, but I froze. There were no bushes or trees in the graveyard, and there was no wind, so where could that sound have come from? I could feel my heart pounding, terrified to move forward, too scared to even turn around. Then, the sound came again, the unmistakable noise of something heavy being dragged across the ground. "Hey guys, stop it, this isn't funny. Rika? Haruna?" I called out, hoping it was just my friends playing a prank on me. That seemed like the most logical explanation. But there was no response, no laughter, no footsteps, just silence. That's when I felt it. Something cold, tight, wrapped around my ankle. At first I didn't understand what it was, but the cold was unbearable. It felt almost like my skin was burning. My eyes snapped down, and I saw what had grabbed me. It wasn't a hand, not exactly. It had a palm, and what looked like fingers, but they were so thin and dry. And instead of regular fingertips, each one had a sharp, claw-like point. The claws dug into my ankle, and the burning cold intensified, mingling with the warmth of my blood. That warmth shocked me out of my dazed state. I slowly turned around, not knowing what I would see. What I saw? I can't even explain properly. It wasn't human. The creature was long and thin, as if it hadn't eaten for years. It had long black hair, so tangled that it seemed like each strand had a life of its own, moving even though there was no breeze. But the face was the worst part. It looked so unnatural. The skin was stretched tight over the bones, and there was a wide, grotesque smile. It stretched unnaturally wide, with rotting yellow teeth, and some that were even black or brown. The smile was so wide, it looked like it was trying to split the creature's face open. The stench it emitted was overpowering, and its eyes, if you could even call them that, were just deep, empty sockets. But somehow, it felt like it was staring right into my soul. Before I could fully process all of this, I saw its other hand reaching for my other ankle. That's when I screamed. I didn't even know I could make such a loud sound, but I tore my foot away and jumped on my bike. I pedaled as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached my apartment. I ran up the stairs, bursting through the door and screaming for my mom. I was ready to show her my ankle and tell her everything. My heart was racing. But when I finally calmed down enough to explain, she just gave me a puzzled look, pointing at my foot. "There's no blood," she said, frowning. "And where's your shoe? Don't tell me you lost it. Those were expensive." I looked down and realized my shoe is indeed missing. In my frenzied panic, I didn't even realize it. And where I knew there had been blood oozing out of before, seemed closed up. Nothing remained, except for my skin was a little red around the ankle. It's been a lot of years since then, and now, I'm pretty sure that it was some sort of lucid dream I had. I had a big imagination after all. My mom said I never came home panicked, and my sisters and friends said that they were sure I had gone home with them. It's almost laughable how scared I was of a simple dream. I'm back in Japan again. I just attended my grandmother's funeral a couple days ago. But something strange just happened that gave me the weirdest feeling of déjà vu. I'm currently visiting the tombstone that has now both my grandmother and grandfather's bones and ashes, and I just found a kid-sized shoe on the ground. There's what looks like some dried blood on it. The shoe looks so familiar, but for the life of me, I can't figure out why. I've made it a personal mission to explore haunted places and uncover urban legends all over Japan. It's not a hobby that's widely accepted, mainly due to deeply rooted superstitions and the general fear of attracting unwanted attention from spirits, but it's something I find not only thrilling, but also deeply rewarding. As an added bonus, it's a great way to practice my Japanese and delve deeper into the country's fascinating folklore. Most people would consider it strange. Some residents even consider it disrespectful. They often advise me to avoid such places, claiming that it's dangerous to provoke the spirits of the dead. I've heard it all: warnings, unsolicited advice, and people shaking their heads in disbelief. But I don't mind. I've learned to be cautious, to respect the stories, and to tread lightly in these forgotten corners of Japan. After all, the more you learn, the less you fear. Now, in the world of urban legends and haunted places, many stories are overhyped, especially those that have been commercialized for tourists or made famous through sensationalized TV shows. A lot of so-called paranormal experiences are little more than a drunk friend's cousin's story, told around a campfire. If you hear it enough times, it starts to sound convincing, especially after a few too many drinks. But not every legend is like that. Some, though rare, are far more chilling, especially when they come from local people who have witnessed something unexplainable, or from places where the atmosphere shifts and you feel like you're being watched. But there's one category of places that always seems to harbor something darker than the rest: the tunnels. I don't know why, but tunnels have always unnerved me. Maybe it's because they're literally a passage to somewhere unknown, somewhere hidden. The claustrophobic nature, the silence, the darkness, they all play tricks on the mind. It's in these places, when something goes wrong with the equipment or strange shadows flicker just out of the corner of your eye, that the fear starts creeping in. There's a deep sense of isolation, a feeling of despair so thick you can almost taste it. I can't explain it, but it's undeniable, and no place has ever made me feel that dread more than Isegami Tunnel. The tunnel, located deep in the mountains between Shizuoka and Aichi, is infamous among urban explorers and ghost hunters alike. Unlike some of the well-known haunted spots that attract curious tourists, Isegami Tunnel has a reputation for being isolated, shrouded in mystery, and unsettling in a way that's difficult to explain. It's not the kind of place you stumble upon by accident, and even those who've heard of it tend to avoid it, especially after sunset. I was there with a group of friends, all of us enthusiasts, eager to document the place for a project we were working on. We weren't expecting anything too dramatic, just the usual: some eerie vibes, maybe a few unexplained noises, and a couple of spooky photos. But what we encountered there was beyond what we could have imagined. I remember the first time we approached the entrance. It was late afternoon, and the sun was still hanging low in the sky. As we neared the tunnel, the atmosphere shifted. It felt like the air grew heavier, colder, and the usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves seemed to fade into an eerie silence. At first, we thought it was just the acoustics of the tunnel, but when we peered inside with our flashlights, that's when things took a strange turn. There was something on the other side. Someone, waiting. From our vantage point, we could just make out two large, dark masses positioned at the far end of the tunnel. They didn't move, they didn't come closer, but they didn't disappear either. They just loitered there, standing still as if watching us. Every now and then, we'd catch a glimpse of them darting from one side of the tunnel entrance to the other, like shadows in the periphery. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no wind, no reason for these shapes to be there. The light from our torches illuminated the ground, but it didn't seem to reach them. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, each of us aware that something wasn't quite right. "Let's keep moving," I suggested, trying to sound confident, but I knew it wasn't working. The hesitation in their eyes told me they felt it too. Yet we were all here for the same reason: the thrill, the adventure, the mystery. Despite the growing unease, we decided to press on. Walking into the darkness of the tunnel, our footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder, more oppressive. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching into the unknown. My flashlight flickered briefly, and I swear I saw something move in the shadows. A flash of motion just beyond the beam of light. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart racing, and turned to my friends. "Did you see that?" I whispered, but they hadn't noticed anything. I could feel it now. Something was with us. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the chill in the air. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched, followed, as if we were intruding on a space that wasn't meant for us. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the feeling intensified. And then, just as we neared the middle of the tunnel, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. My friends and I stopped. The atmosphere felt thicker. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the tunnel itself was alive, aware of our presence. That's when I saw it again. The dark shapes. This time they were closer, more distinct. Their forms were almost humanoid, but their movements, jerky, unnatural, gave them an unsettling, otherworldly appearance. They didn't approach us directly, but their presence was undeniable. It was as if they were circling, surrounding us, testing us, waiting for the right moment to make their move. We didn't stick around to find out. One of my friends, clearly rattled, motioned for us to leave, and without a word, we turned and sprinted back toward the entrance. The feeling of being chased lingered, but we didn't dare look back. We made it out of the tunnel, but the air still felt heavy around us. The darkness of the tunnel lingering in our minds long after we left. We didn't speak much on our way back, each of us lost in our thoughts, but we all knew something was waiting in there. And whatever it was, it didn't want us there. I don't know if I'll go back to Isegami Tunnel. The allure of the unknown is strong, but so is the fear of what I might encounter if I return. Some places are better left unexplored, their secrets better left untouched. But I won't forget what I felt that day. And I don't think I ever will. We had barely made it halfway through the tunnel when the torches suddenly flickered and died, as if some unseen force had drained their power. It happened so quickly that we were left in complete darkness. The coldness of the tunnel seemed to intensify, pressing in from all sides. It was an eerie sensation, like the very walls of the tunnel were closing in on us, trapping us in a void where sound and light were no longer reliable. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. My heart raced in my chest as my mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. And then from the other side of the tunnel, where all had been quiet moments ago, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But they weren't normal footsteps. They were rapid, uneven, and they echoed with a disturbing intensity. The heavy smacks of running feet bounced off the walls as something, or someone, sprinted toward us in the pitch black. It felt like it was right on top of us, its presence closing in. But I couldn't see anything. In a blind panic, I turned to look at my friends, only to see that they were already rushing toward the entrance, their figures mere shadows in the darkness. Their torches were completely out, leaving us in total blackness. I followed their lead, my heart hammering in my chest, and we bolted back the way we had come. Once we reached the safety of the outside world, we gathered in a huddled group, each of us gasping for breath, trying to explain what we had just experienced. My voice shook as I told them about the running footsteps, how they had gotten closer and closer, but I never saw a figure. My friend, who had been closest to the back of the group, nervously added that she had heard the unmistakable sound of children giggling, high-pitched and unnaturally joyful, echoing through the dark. Another friend, his face pale under the light of the moon, described seeing something move quickly in front of his torch beam before it flickered out, as if a shadow had crossed the light with terrifying speed. The final member of our group, usually the most grounded and practical one, said she had seen a white pipe on the wall. She'd noticed it at first, thinking it was odd, but when she looked again, it had disappeared completely. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just some freak accident, a malfunction in the torches, a trick of the mind, but something didn't sit right. We were shaken, and curiosity soon took over. We started to dig deeper into the history of the tunnel, hoping to find a rational explanation for what had happened. We scoured old records, local legends, and even spoke to people who lived nearby, hoping for some clarity. What we uncovered sent a chill down our spines. Apparently, years ago, 2 young children had died in the tunnel during a violent storm. The storm had been so fierce that it triggered flash flooding, and the children were swept away. Their mother had rushed to the tunnel, searching desperately for her lost children, but she was caught in the flood as well, and she drowned just outside the tunnel's entrance. Local legends claimed that on stormy nights, the spirits of the children would rush toward anyone who dared to enter the tunnel, their restless souls seeking attention. And even more disturbing was the claim that the mother's ghost would climb along the interior walls of the tunnel, scuttling like a pale spider, her limbs unnaturally long, her face hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, the strange experiences we had endured in that tunnel made a horrific kind of sense. The footsteps I had heard, the chilling giggles of children, the shadowy movements in the dark, they all seemed to match the descriptions of the haunting. And the white pipe my friend had seen? After hearing the stories, it struck us that it could have been the pale, skeletal limb of the grieving mother, stretching along the walls as she searched for her children. We could no longer dismiss what had happened as a coincidence or a prank. The terror we felt that night was rooted in something much darker, something that had lingered in that tunnel for years, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon it. 3 days ago, I received an unsettling email from a friend of mine who lives in Japan. Receiving emails from him wasn't unusual. We often kept in touch this way, whether through messages, video chats, or sharing updates on our various projects. His emails usually contained pictures and videos from his urban exploring and ghost hunting adventures across Japan, places that most people would never dare to visit. We had bonded over a shared fascination with abandoned buildings and haunted locations, so I always looked forward to hearing about his latest excursions. However, this time, his email felt different. There was an unmistakable weight to it, an ominous tone that immediately made me uneasy. I have chosen to omit the names of the people involved in this story out of respect for their privacy, as the details of what happened are deeply personal and unsettling. 2. XXX Subject Aokigahara Forest. It had been several weeks since we last caught up, and he was curious about how things were going for me in Korea. After a few pleasantries, he got straight to the point. He had been in the hospital for the past few weeks, and he was writing to me from there. His message was vague at first, but he eventually explained why he had ended up in the hospital, and the reason was something I could never have expected. A few weeks prior, he and his girlfriend, Ayumi, a name I'm sure I've mentioned before, decided to visit Aokigahara Forest, famously known as the Suicide Forest. I had heard of it, as had most people, given its sinister reputation and connection to numerous tragic events. They had been intrigued by the stories surrounding it, particularly the idea of its dark history and the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to permeate the forest. They had driven for hours that morning, arriving in the afternoon around 2 p.m. They intended to stay for the night, but it was only after the visitor center closed that they began their journey into the heart of the forest. It was then that they noticed something strange. In the parking lot, there was a car still parked, despite the fact that it had layers of dust on it, as though it had been there for a long time. At the time, they found it odd, but didn't give it much thought. However, in hindsight, he admitted that he wished he had paid more attention to the foreboding sign it seemed to represent. They entered the forest at around 5 p.m. It should have still been light enough to see, but the atmosphere felt unusually dark. Despite the sun still being up, the dense canopy of trees created an overwhelming sense of shadow, and they found themselves surrounded by an eerie silence. The forest was beautiful, yes, but there was something about it, something unseen, that made them both feel intensely uncomfortable. Every step felt like they were being watched, and they couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were observing them. As they ventured deeper into the woods, things began to take a more sinister turn. They started finding strange remnants along the path. discarded clothing, shoes, and abandoned food items. The sight of these objects left behind in such a place seemed odd, but what truly unsettled them were the ropes hanging from several of the trees, as though placed intentionally. The unease that had been building in them began to crystallize into dread. They couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was lurking just beyond their line of sight, watching them. The further they went, the more palpable the sensation became, and soon they began to hear something, breaking branches. The unmistakable sound of footsteps followed them, getting louder and closer. The two of them broke into a run, and the sound of something chasing them intensified, its footsteps echoing off the trees. The air was filled with a blood-curdling scream that froze their blood. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before, and it seemed to come from all directions at once, sending their hearts racing. In the chaos, Ayumi screamed, and he looked back to see something emerge from the shadows, reaching for her. Before he could act, she was gone, her body disappearing into the darkness. Paralyzed by fear, he stopped running for a split second to process what had just happened. That was when he saw it, something standing in the trees, watching him. At first, he couldn't make out much as it was obscured by the shadows, but the figure was tall, too tall, and its movements were unnaturally slow and deliberate. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As he stared, the figure's body seemed to shift, and he heard the sickening sound of bones cracking, like the bones of a creature coming to life after years of stillness. He froze, unable to move, but his instincts screamed at him to run. Finally, fear broke through the paralysis, and he took off, not caring that his chest burned with each breath. All that mattered was escaping the forest, and whatever that thing was. He didn't look back. I ran blindly through the thick trees, heart pounding in my chest, desperately trying to get away from whatever was chasing me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and with each step, I felt my strength starting to drain. I didn't know where I was going. The world around me had become a blur of shadows and panic. In my mind, all I could hear was the sound of Ayumi's scream and the awful, unnatural noise of the creature's movements behind me. I wept for her, my heart breaking, but at the same time, I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. It felt like hours, though I knew it must have only been minutes before something caught my eye in the distance. Through the darkness, I spotted a faint light, a soft glow in the distance that pierced through the dense forest like a beacon. Without thinking, I pushed myself harder, forcing my tired legs to carry me toward it. As I got closer, the light became more defined, and I could make out a man holding a Coleman lantern. I recognized him immediately. He was the man who had left his car in the parking lot, the one that had seemed so out of place earlier. He was mumbling to himself under his breath, but the words were indistinguishable, lost in the wind and the panic that gripped me. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could tell he was motioning for me to come closer. Without hesitating, I stumbled toward him, my body moving on autopilot, driven by the hope of safety. He wordlessly gestured for me to enter his tent. I couldn't bring myself to question him, not with the fear still pulsing in my veins. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The weight of what had happened to Ayumi was almost too much to bear, but at that moment, the only thing I could think about was getting some rest. I crawled into the tent, and the next thing I knew, I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, the horror of the previous night flooded back into my mind. For a few moments, I was disoriented, as if waking from a nightmare, but then the cold reality hit me. Ayumi was gone. I remembered her scream, the terrible thing that had taken her, and my heart sank again. I had to call the authorities. I needed help, but where was the man who had helped me? I looked around the tent. There was no sign of him. The lantern had been extinguished, and the place felt eerily silent. I stepped outside, still reeling from the events that had unfolded, and was immediately hit by a foul, rancid smell that made my stomach churn. I turned around, dreading what I might find, and there he was. The man who had saved me, the one who had offered me refuge in the tent, was lying lifeless on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural way. The stench was unbearable, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I knelt beside him, my mind still clouded with disbelief. What had happened? How had he died? I didn't know, and at that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was that he had helped me. I silently thanked him, covering his body with a blanket from the tent. It was the least I could do for him. The realization that I was alone again in the forest, with no one to help, overwhelmed me. But somehow, I managed to find the strength to keep moving. I stumbled out of the tent, not even thinking about the direction I was going, but as fate would have it, the tent had been set up near the entrance to the forest. I didn't understand it at the time, but later I would learn that Aokigahara Forest has a way of playing tricks on your mind. It disorients you, confuses your sense of direction, and keeps you trapped in its depths longer than you ever intend to be. Somehow, I made it to the edge of the forest. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and my legs finally gave out beneath me. I collapsed, not caring what happened next. When I finally came to, I was in a hospital room. The sterile, white walls and the sound of the steady beeping from the machines around me felt like a strange comfort compared to the terror I had just experienced. The doctors said I would be released in 2 days. But I couldn't rest. Not really. My mind was consumed with the image of Ayumi, the terror of the night, and the man's lifeless body. I knew what I had to do. As soon as I was able, I was going back to Aokigahara. I couldn't leave her like that. I couldn't let that thing take her without a fight. I was going to find Ayumi, and I was going to destroy whatever it was that had taken her from me. The email ended there, and I sat in silence, staring at the screen, my mind racing. My friend had always been the strong one, the one who kept his composure. But now I could feel the weight of his grief and fear through every word. I knew what he was like when he was grieving, and I couldn't let him go back there alone. I had to be there with him. I couldn't let him face that thing, whatever it was, by himself. This story is a retelling of an event that took place when I was just 7 years old. Over the years, I've tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that it couldn't possibly be real. But no matter how hard I try to push it out of my mind, a small part of me still believes it happened. It was in Tokyo, at a subway station, a place I now pass by routinely, but back then, it was the setting for one of the strangest experiences of my life. I was standing beside my father, waiting for our train to arrive, when I saw something that made my heart stop. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but after blinking and squinting, I saw it clearly. A creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a demon, towering over the crowd, with thick fur that looked matted and wild, like it hadn't seen a good grooming in ages. Its wings were leathery, black, and massive, spanning wide enough to almost block the flow of people walking past it. The creature's face was elongated, with a snout that resembled an anteater's, complete with sharp, menacing teeth. I must have stared at it for a solid 10 minutes, unable to look away, when it suddenly muttered something, just loud enough for me to hear. "This human is creeping me out," it said. "It almost looks like it's looking right at me." It was then that I realized it was speaking about me. Without thinking, I responded, "I am looking right at you." The demon froze, its entire body tensing. The look on its face was one of pure shock. "You can see me?" it asked, as if the idea was unthinkable. "Yes. Can't everybody?" "No," it replied with a soft growl, "not unless they're in the 5th dimension." I tilted my head, confused. "Am I in the 5th dimension?" The demon seemed to take a moment, as though thinking, and then replied, "Your mind must have slipped over here by mistake. What were you thinking about before you saw me?" I paused, wondering why I hadn't realized it sooner. "Trains," I said, the answer coming to me quickly. "Ah," the demon said with a hint of amusement. "Well, trains are the link between our dimensions. I guess your mind must have just wandered over here. Either that, or you're going crazy." "I hope I'm not going crazy," I said, more to myself than to the demon. "Being crazy is a good thing in the 5th dimension," the demon said, almost cheerfully. I laughed, nervous, trying to shake the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. "Do you have subway lines in the 5th dimension?" The demon's response was almost casual. "Of course," it said. "How else would we get to work?" I blinked, trying to process that. "But you've got wings," I pointed out, the absurdity of the situation slowly creeping into my awareness. "Yes," it replied, "but who wants to fly? Taking the train is much faster, and if I fly to work, I'm all sweaty by the time I get there. You really don't want to deal with that. I frowned, thinking about it. So, what do you use your wings for then? The demon looked down at its wings as if considering the question for the first time. I put them over my head when it rains, it said with a matter-of-fact tone. Can I see? I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. The demon seemed to ponder that for a moment before it nodded, but then, as if remembering something, it paused and glanced around. Not here, it said. Not in public. People would notice. I wasn't sure what to make of the whole thing. Half of me was still convinced it was some strange, vivid dream, while the other half was terrified that this creature might be real. Still, it didn't feel hostile. Odd, but not dangerous. At least not right away. The subway station, busy and bustling with commuters, seemed to fade away as I stood there, talking to a demon in the fifth dimension, trying to make sense of the world I had stumbled into. Sure, the demon said. The wind whipped through my hair as his enormous wings unfurled and rose high above him, creating a gust of air that made my hair blow back. I couldn't help but laugh, and my eyes widened as I stared in awe at the sheer size of them. You're funny, I said, unable to suppress my amusement. The demon chuckled too, but then his expression changed. A shadow passed over his face, and he looked distant, as if something had troubled him. Are you okay? I asked, concerned by his sudden shift in mood. You seem sad. The demon didn't look at me. Instead, his eyes were fixed on something behind me, something I couldn't see. He sighed deeply. Yes, he said, his voice low and distant. Say, would you like to see a magic trick? Okay, I replied, eager to see what he could do next. The demon reached up, extending one of his long, clawed fingers and tugged at something I couldn't see. With a flick, a long, rainbow-colored handkerchief emerged from his snout. The bright, multicolored cloth streamed out in a continuous line, twisting and turning in the air like it was alive. He must have pulled out 20 feet of it before it finally stopped. That's funny, I laughed, fascinated by the sight. But suddenly, something strange happened. I realized I wasn't holding my dad's hand anymore. I looked around in confusion, expecting to see the familiar subway station, but the station had disappeared. Instead, I found myself surrounded by vast, rolling meadows of lush green grass. In the distance, old rusted trains sat idle, covered in moss and weeds, as if they hadn't moved in years. I can't see the subway station anymore, I said, my voice trembling slightly with disbelief. That's okay, the demon replied softly. Sometimes it's better to see what isn't there instead of what is. What do you mean? I asked, trying to understand. The demon stared into the distance, his gaze unfocused. Sometimes, when I'm bored or sad, my mind slips off to the third dimension, and I see people like you. I tilted my head, processing his words. That's funny, I said with a small chuckle. Can you go to other dimensions too? The demon didn't answer. His attention was fixed upward, watching something in the sky. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. It's starting to rain, he said softly, his wings lifting again, this time over his head, protecting himself from the light drizzle that had begun to fall. Warm droplets of rain hit my face. I reached up to wipe them away, but they felt strangely comforting, as if the rain were somehow familiar. Can I get under your wings with you? I asked, feeling the coolness of the rain start to seep through my clothes. Not now, he said. You've got to go home. I didn't understand. Why did I have to go home? I wasn't ready to leave. But before I could ask again, something strange began to happen. The world around me shimmered, and everything seemed to twist and blur together. The green meadows and rusted trains spun around me in a dizzying swirl, like different shades of paint mixing together. The world was spinning faster and faster, and I could feel myself becoming lightheaded. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but the world didn't stop. I felt nauseous, as though the very air was twisting and pulling me in all directions. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. I opened my eyes, blinking in confusion, and saw a different scene entirely. I was no longer in the meadow with the demon. Instead, I was lying on the ground, with my mother kneeling beside me, her face streaked with tears. I could feel her hand on my forehead, gently brushing my hair away from my face. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice small and weak. My mind was foggy, and I couldn't remember what had happened. Did he bring me home? But my mother only shook her head, her tears falling silently. She didn't answer me right away. The look on her face told me that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp. As the moments passed, the unsettling feeling that had lingered in my mind grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that the world around me was not quite right, that something I couldn't see, something just out of reach, was hovering at the edge of my awareness. I had no idea what had happened during the time I had been unconscious, but the strange world I had seen, the demon, the rain, and the trains, none of it seemed to make sense. Was I dreaming? Or had I slipped into another dimension, just as the demon had said? It didn't matter. All that mattered now was the cold emptiness I felt inside. The world had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to find my way back. "Yes, darling," she said softly, though her eyes didn't meet mine. Her voice sounded distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. "He brought you home, and then he had to go away." I blinked in confusion. The words didn't quite register. "Oh," was all I could manage to say. "When will he be back?" Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I don't know," she replied, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Her voice trembled, and something about her posture felt wrong. She wasn't telling me the full truth, but I didn't understand why. For years, I didn't fully understand the meaning behind her words. My father never came back. The house grew quieter, colder, as if he had simply faded away. I remember asking my mom, time and again, when he would return. Each time her response would be the same, but it would grow weaker with every passing day. And then, when I was old enough, I learned the truth. My father had killed himself that day. It was a heartbreaking revelation, one that shattered everything I thought I knew. That morning, before he had taken me to the subway station, my father had written a note. It was addressed to my mother, explaining that he intended to take me with him, to step in front of the train. He wanted to end it all together. When my mother found the note after work, her world crumbled. She immediately called the police, but it was already too late. The train had already come and gone. The witnesses told the police that just before he jumped, I had pulled away from his hand, running off in panic. I had fainted not long after, falling unconscious in a daze, as my mind couldn't process what was happening. But then, there was a peculiar detail that caught my attention. One of the witnesses, a little boy around my age at the time, claimed to have seen something I couldn't remember. He said he saw something huge, something monstrous, that had reached out for my hand just as I was about to step toward my father. The boy described it as a creature taller than any man, with fur covered in matted patches, its wings wide and leathery, like they belonged to something from another world. The creature had an elongated snout like an anteater's, and it towered over me, its presence chilling, yet somehow protective. The boy said that the creature took my hand and led me away from the train, guiding me to safety just in time. But I had no memory of any of this. When I regained consciousness, I was at home, disoriented, with no recollection of what had happened at the station. Only the vague memory of my mother's tears and the emptiness that had replaced the warmth of my father's hand. No one else ever saw the creature again. And when I asked my mother about it, she only said that I had been confused, that I had imagined the whole thing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the boy's story was consistent with something I had felt, something deep down. Maybe it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Maybe that creature had really saved me, preventing me from following my father's tragic path. A few years ago, I worked as an English teacher at a middle school in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. My role as an assistant language teacher (ALT) meant that I was assigned to teach at 3 different schools. I lived in Seto, a small, rural city that, while known for its pottery, didn't have much to offer in terms of excitement. What stood out the most, though, was the constant, almost oppressive atmosphere. It was as if the town itself had a heavy, melancholic feel, like a ghost town where people were still walking around, but the energy was long gone. The 3 schools I was assigned to, Minase Junior High, Soto Junior High, and Motoyama Junior High, were located on hills. From the train station, Owariseto, I could walk to any of them in under 25 minutes. The walk wasn't exactly pleasant, as the roads were steep and winding, but it became a part of the daily routine. Despite the isolation, I found joy in teaching the students, playing games, and enjoying the small class sizes, which helped to create an intimate, at-home atmosphere. Being assigned to 3 schools wasn't easy, though. Every week, I spent Monday to Friday at one school. On Wednesdays, I'd get a fax, yes, a fax, detailing my schedule and which textbook pages I would be covering. Preparing lessons and activities often took hours, and there was always more work to do. Some teachers were at school from early morning to late at night, with many of them also balancing family life. I, too, found myself working long hours, sometimes staying until 7 or 8 p.m., and walking back home in the dark, relying on the faint light of my phone and the moon. Though Japan is generally considered a very safe country, its deep-rooted traditions sometimes made the place feel as though it was stuck in time, and the sense of déjà vu could be overwhelming. It was December, and winter break was approaching. In Japan, the end-of-year party, or bunenkai, is a tradition, and the school staff weren't excluded from this annual festivity. I was invited to the bunenkai at Motoyama Junior High, the school I liked the most. We had a great time laughing, dancing, singing, and listening to the principal's drunken stories. Despite being the only foreigner there, I felt fully integrated, part of the family. Then, as the evening wore on, the principal sobered up. With a red face and slightly slurred speech, he looked at me and asked, "So Chris-sensei, you like scary stories, right?" The room fell silent, and I could feel the mood shift. The other teachers exchanged awkward glances, their smiles tightening. "Of course I do," I replied with a grin, playing along. "When are you going back to Minase?" the principal asked, still watching me closely. "After winter break, I think. Tuesday, maybe?" The atmosphere suddenly changed. The staff grew quieter, eyes shifting between me and the principal, who now had an almost sinister look on his face. "Well," he began, dragging out his words, "Minase is haunted. In fact, many schools in Seto have a dark past. Even our school, Motoyama, has its stories." I thought this might be some kind of prank, an initiation, or just some drunken storytelling to freak me out. The teachers were staring, some holding back smirks, but the principal wasn't laughing. I played along, pretending to be clueless. "How so?" I asked, giving my best "I'm just an innocent foreigner" face, leaning in with interest. "Well," he continued, eyes narrowing, "there's a story about a student who committed suicide in the late 60s. They say she comes back on Friday nights to the G classroom, looking for the teacher who mistreated her. Exactly at 9 p.m. she appears in the classroom and just stays there until she leaves. Any teacher who has seen her quits immediately, and many of them end up following in her footsteps, committing suicide in the same way." A few years ago, I worked as a middle school English teacher in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. My role as an alt-assistant language teacher had me assigned to 3 schools, Minase JHS, Soto JHS, and Motoyama JHS. My assigned city, Seto, was a quiet, rural village best known for its pottery. The town always felt somber, almost like a ghost town. Even though it was populated, there was a lingering, eerie feeling in the air, as if something unseen was always watching. I walked to all 3 schools, and no matter which one I went to, the journey always involved hiking up a hill. The walk wasn't much fun, especially after long days of teaching, but I enjoyed my time with the kids. The small classes created an atmosphere that felt more like home, a dynamic the Japanese call at-home learning. Teaching at 3 schools, however, was exhausting. My schedule was always busy, and I often stayed late at the staff room, leaving school at 7 and walking home in near darkness, relying only on the light of the moon and my dying phone's flashlight to guide me. Despite Japan's reputation for being one of the safest countries, there were times when I felt a tinge of unease, particularly during these late-night walks. It was mid-December when winter break began, and like every other year, the staff threw a bunenkai, end-of-year party. I was invited to my favorite school's bunenkai, Motoyama JHS, and had a great time. We all laughed, sang, and enjoyed each other's company, and I didn't feel out of place, even though I was the only foreigner in the room. That was when the principal, now quite tipsy from the sake, leaned over and asked me if I liked scary stories. I jokingly said, "Of course." And he proceeded to tell me something that made the entire room go eerily silent. The principal shared a chilling tale about Minase JHS. He mentioned a student who had committed suicide in the late 60s, and her ghost was said to haunt the school, appearing every Friday night in the G classroom. the special education class, at exactly 9 p.m. No one had ever seen the ghost, but the principal claimed that every teacher who had encountered her had either quit or, worse, met the same tragic end as the student, committing suicide in the same way she had. At first, I thought it was just an elaborate prank, some sort of initiation into Japanese school culture, or maybe just a local urban legend. Still, I couldn't help but be intrigued by the story. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided that the next Friday I would visit the G classroom at 9 p.m. to see for myself. But as I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange behind the principal's story. The next week, I arrived at Minase JHS, ready to return to work after winter break. It was a cold, rainy day, and as I entered the staff room, the usual noise and cheer were noticeably absent. The teachers were busy preparing for the new term, but the atmosphere felt oddly heavy. I left school early that day, walking home as I did so many times before. But this time, my mind kept returning to the story the principal had told. By Friday, I was eager to witness the legend for myself. Nervous yet excited, I knew exactly where I'd be headed at 9 p.m. Wednesday passed without incident. After school, I made my way to the G classroom around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still out, and the room was filled with a warm golden glow that seemed completely at odds with the creepy stories I had heard. The air was calm, almost serene. It didn't feel like a place where a ghost would linger. The silence in the room was only broken by the ticking of the clock on the wall. That clock. It was annoyingly 3 minutes fast, and that little detail irritated me more than it should have. As a teacher, you become hyper-aware of every minute, and that damn clock had caused me to be late to class on more than one occasion. I reminded myself that I'd be back here tomorrow to teach, so I went downstairs to finish preparing for the next day's lessons. Once everything was in order, I left early, not wanting to walk home in the dark. Thursday came with the usual groans of students who were not ready to get back to work. As always, I had a packed day of lessons, with no free periods to relax. When lunch came, I ate with the first-year students and tried to keep up with their conversation about some anime I didn't recognize. After lunch, the school bell rang, signaling recess. The students cleaned up their classrooms as part of their daily routine, and soon the bell rang for them to go outside. I joined the second years for a quick game of soccer, keeping an eye on the school's courtyard. From where I stood, I glanced up at the G-class window. The curtains were drawn shut. This struck me as strange because they never closed the curtains in winter. The room would get too cold without the sunlight streaming in. I thought about it briefly, but brushed it off as just another oddity in the school. It was probably nothing. After recess, I went to teach in the G class, and the class was, as usual, a peaceful one. The students were lively and friendly, and I forgot about the whole ghost story entirely. My focus returned to the lesson plans, and I couldn't help but feel a little foolish for letting the whole thing get under my skin. There was nothing strange about the school, or so I thought. Later, the school day ended earlier than usual, and I stayed behind to help coach the soccer team. Every now and then, I found myself glancing up at the G-class window, half expecting to see a girl with long black hair staring down at me, like something out of a cheesy Japanese horror movie. But every time I looked, the window was empty. By the time I was finishing up, it was getting darker, and I knew I'd be walking home late again. The thought of it no longer bothered me. I had somehow convinced myself that the stories of ghosts and strange happenings in the school were nothing more than overblown urban legends. But as I walked toward the school gates, I glanced up one last time at the G-class window. I froze. There, standing in the window, was one of the G-class teachers. He was staring directly outside, his face expressionless and unblinking. I glanced to where his gaze was directed, but there was nothing unusual there. The street was quiet and dark, and no one else was in sight. The teacher didn't even seem to notice me as I stood there, staring up at him. I couldn't help but feel a chill creep down my spine. That room, the G class, had always felt off. Something about it had unsettled me from the very beginning, but now it was even worse. I quickly turned away and hurried home, the long walk stretching out before me like a trail of anxiety. Friday arrived, and I couldn't shake the thoughts from my mind. I was already mentally preparing for the evening. I had decided that tonight, at exactly 9 p.m., I would go up to the G class to see what would happen. I didn't know what I expected, but I was compelled to know more. The closer it got to the evening, the more anxious I became. I had never stayed this late at the school before, and the thought of doing so sent a shiver through me. By 5:30 p.m., the sun had already started setting, and a thunderstorm rolled in, making the air heavy and damp. I couldn't help but mutter to myself, "Man, if I do this for nothing and end up walking home in the rain, I'm going to lose my mind." The staff room had begun to empty as the teachers left for the day. One by one, they trickled out until only a few remained. It was getting darker outside, and the fluorescent lights in the staff room buzzed faintly in the otherwise silent room. I was alone with my thoughts, feeling the weight of the evening settle in. By 7:30 p.m., only 6 or 7 teachers were left. The staff room was eerily quiet, with most of the lights switched off. The only illumination came from the dim, buzzing lights overhead. I could hear the soft patter of rain against the windows and the occasional gust of wind rattling the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the clock. It was getting close to 9 p.m. I could feel the anticipation building up in me, and a strange sense of dread settled deep in my gut. The school was quiet now. Too quiet. The teachers continued leaving one by one, each casting me odd glances as I lingered in the staff room. It was clear I was staying later than I usually did, and I could sense a subtle shift in the air. "You're really putting in the hours today, Chris-sensei," one teacher remarked with a nervous laugh. I could hear the faint suspicion in his voice. "Yeah, gotta make sure my supervisor doesn't think I'm slacking." I tried to laugh it off, but there was something unnerving about the way the teacher said it. I was getting a weird feeling in my stomach, but I ignored it and went back to my work. By 8:30, there were only 3 of us left in the staff room. The lights flickered slightly above me. I froze for a moment before reminding myself that they always did that. It was just the cheap fluorescent lights. But the unsettling atmosphere was growing. My nerves were on edge, and the pit in my stomach was growing heavier. I was having second thoughts, questioning whether I should even go upstairs, but something pushed me forward. I had come this far, so I had to finish it. I waited until it was nearly 8:50 before I stood up. "Gonna head to the toilet," I said to the 2 teachers still sitting at their desks. They glanced up at me, barely acknowledging my words before turning back to their work. I silently made my way to the door, careful not to make too much noise. Once I stepped into the hallway, I closed the door behind me. One thing I hated about Japanese schools was the lack of central heating and air conditioning. While the staff room was kept warm by a few space heaters, the hallways, classrooms, and bathrooms were often freezing. On a rainy winter night, the cold air in the hallway was unbearable. Each time I exhaled, my breath formed clouds of vapor in front of me. The hallway was pitch black, except for the faint green glow of the exit signs that dimly lit the way. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The silence was unbearable. All I could hear was the sound of rain pounding on the roof, the distant hum of the exit sign, and the eerie quiet that had settled over the school. My footsteps seemed too loud against the silence, each step echoing through the cold, empty halls. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, and the sensation was starting to feel like a nightmare. When I reached the staircase, I hesitated for a moment before climbing slowly up the steps. Each step felt heavier than the last. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt thick with tension. My mind kept racing. Was this a mistake? But I pushed the doubt aside and forced myself to continue upward. When I reached the second floor, I froze. The hallway stretched before me, long and dark, with no end in sight. My phone's weak light only illuminated a small patch of the floor in front of me, leaving the rest of the hallway shrouded in blackness. The place felt like a void, swallowing up any sense of safety. I stood in front of the sliding door that led into the G classroom, my nerves on high alert. I had no idea what time it was, but I wasn't going to check. I was terrified of seeing that it was 9, and that the ghost of Kimiko would be standing right in front of me. I took a deep breath. Screw it. I've never been this weak. I muttered to myself, trying to convince myself that I wasn't afraid. But the fear gnawed at me. I slid the door open and the darkness inside the classroom swallowed me whole. I shone my phone's light around the room, but the darkness seemed to absorb it, stretching out beyond the range of the beam. The room was silent, except for the rain hammering against the massive windows. The clock above the blackboard caught my eye. 8:59. The tension was unbearable. This was it. I pressed my back against the window, positioning myself so I could see the entire room, even though I could barely see a few feet in front of me. If she was going to appear, at least I'd be ready for it. 10 seconds. The sound of the rain intensified, or maybe it was just my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Everything in the room felt unnaturally still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I glanced at the clock again. 9. But nothing happened. And then I started hearing things. There was a soft shuffle near the door, a faint creak of a chair. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My heart skipped a beat. I felt something cold, almost as if the room itself had shifted or had become colder. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard a sound, a soft, slow creak from the far corner of the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. My blood ran cold. The ticking of the clock sounded unnaturally loud, each second stretching out as if mocking my fear. I winced, instinctively throwing my hands up, ready to defend myself if something or someone appeared in front of me. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 9 p.m. Friday night. I shone my phone's light on the clock to confirm. I exhaled, my body flooded with a sense of dread that quickly shifted into relief. Tears welled up in my eyes from sheer terror. But suddenly, a calmness washed over me. Nothing had happened. There was nothing there. How could I have been so foolish? A spirit returning at the exact moment of death, haunting its place of demise. Sure, it sounded good in fiction, but this was real life. That kind of thing didn't happen. I let out a small, nervous chuckle, as though I had conquered whatever force had haunted that room. But even with my newfound confidence, I still couldn't bring myself to illuminate the entire room with my phone. Fear of the unknown, perhaps? I took a deep breath and turned my back to the door, something I'd been too terrified to do just moments before. I stood there with a grin spreading across my face. The rain continued to hammer outside, but I felt peaceful. After being gripped by fear 1 minute and completely calm the next, everything felt serene. I couldn't help but laugh at myself for being so afraid. I pulled out my phone, eager to share my experience with my friend, joking about how foolish I had been. And then, my stomach dropped. I glanced at my phone. It said 8:58. Then, just seconds later, it flicked to 8:59. I had completely forgotten that the clock in the classroom was fast. The moment I realized that, panic set in. Fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I bolted out of the classroom, leaping down the stairs, the hallway stretching before me like a dark tunnel. I rushed back to the staff room, my breath coming in ragged gasps, tears starting to well up in my eyes once more. Only one teacher remained in the staff room, glancing up at me in surprise. "Everything okay?" she asked. I stared at her for a few seconds, struggling to catch my breath. "Yes," I said, nodding shakily. "Oh, okay, that's good. Can you keep the hallway door open? It's kind of stuffy in here." The very thought of leaving that door open horrified me. What if she was out there? What if I had just narrowly escaped something? But I had no choice. I couldn't say no without looking insane. With a shaky hand, I left the door open and returned to my desk, glancing back over my shoulder repeatedly, the fear never quite leaving me. "Is everything okay, Chris-sensei?" the teacher asked, her voice sounding distant now, as if my mind had already wandered far away. She was the oldest teacher in the school, always just a little off, but kind nonetheless. I stammered, still trembling. I was going to head home, but I heard thunder, so I ran back. I'm really afraid of thunder. "Aw, that's so cute. Even a big, strong man like you is afraid of thunder. I see. When I was younger, She began to ramble on, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind had gone numb. I was frozen in place, my body stiff with fear. Goosebumps prickled my skin, every hair on my neck standing on end like static electricity. My hands trembled uncontrollably. My mouth went dry, my eyes wide open and unfocused. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the air in front of me. It was all because of the sound. A noise. The unmistakable sound of wet footsteps. They were faint, but I heard them clearly. The floor squeaked with each step. Someone, or something, was walking down the hallway slowly. The sound grew closer. My eyes darted to the clock on the wall. 9 o'clock and 5 seconds. I had to be sure. She's here. The teacher kept talking, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. I couldn't hear her words anymore. My ears felt muffled, as if the world had narrowed down to only that sound. My mind was screaming, but I couldn't move. I forced myself to cut her off. "Excuse me," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Did you hear that?" But I wasn't waiting for her answer. I was already half rising from my chair, my heart pounding. I had to know, had to see. I asked, my voice wavering, "What time are you leaving tonight?" "Oh, actually, I was just about to leave in a few minutes," she replied kindly. "Would you like a ride to Owariseto Station? I know you have to go all the way back to Tajimi." I'd been dreading the lonely walk back in the dark, so I quickly said, "I'd love to, if it's not out of your way." Slowly, I could feel my heartbeat return to normal. She grabbed the school key and started locking up the front door. The other teachers had already taken care of their respective doors, leaving the last one for her. As we walked toward it, a sense of unease washed over me. I couldn't shake the thought that I was walking through the same door a dead girl might have just passed through. Who knows when she'd come back to claim her spot again? But with the elderly teacher by my side, I tried to calm myself, thinking I was in safe company. At that moment, she seemed almost like a protective figure, a sage of sorts. She switched off the staff room lights, and we made our way to the entrance. It was dark outside, and as we stepped out, I froze for a moment, my heart racing. I stepped into a small puddle near the stairs and felt an icy chill surge through me. Words failed me. I was completely mute with terror. My body went numb, and I couldn't speak. We exchanged our indoor slippers for our outdoor shoes and left the building. She locked the door behind us, and we both opened our umbrellas. The tension in the air was palpable as we walked to her small car, the raindrops tapping rhythmically on our umbrellas. The car ride to the station was silent. She tried to ease the atmosphere by talking about her grandson, about acorns she loved to collect. After a brief silence, though, she suddenly changed the subject. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I was a student at Minase when I was a little girl. It was a beautiful school then, and it still is now." I nodded politely. "Yeah, it is beautiful," she continued, her tone turning a little more somber. "But you know, I remember when tragedy struck the school. The entire school mourned for an entire week. It made national news, even though Seto is just a little village. 2 sisters, Kimiko and Rumiko, took their own lives. Such a shame." "Wait," I hesitated. 2 girls? I thought I heard an urban legend about 1 girl dying, not 2. My breath began to grow shallow. "That's the problem with urban legends," she said, her voice almost matter-of-fact. "They're based on real events, but they never get the facts right. I'll never forget what happened, even if I live to be 100. Kimiko and Rumiko were both horribly bullied by a cruel teacher. He locked them both in the G classroom one day and then went off to the staff room. They both committed suicide at different times. The legend you've probably heard is about Kimiko, right? How she shows up at 9 p.m.? I nodded slowly, hanging on every word. "Yeah," I said, almost nervously. "But that sounds different from what you're saying. Wasn't it just Kimiko's story?" "Well," she continued, "some people say Kimiko does show up at 9 p.m., but that's only part of it. What you didn't hear is that Rumiko shows up 10 minutes before that. She stays until Kimiko is ready to leave." I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart seemed to freeze in my chest, and tears began to well up in my eyes. I was shaking, utterly unnerved by what I was hearing. "Rumiko died first, after all," the teacher added in a quiet voice. "But even if they were there, it wouldn't matter. The lights in the upstairs classrooms would have already been turned off by the maintenance man. It'd be too dark to see anything unless the room was bathed in moonlight." My whole body went cold. I was frozen, barely able to process what she was saying. The silence stretched, and I couldn't even focus on the road anymore. We arrived at Owariseto Station, but I was still lost in the story. The old teacher smiled warmly as she parked, but my mind was far away. Here we are, Owari Seto Station, she said cheerfully. Be careful on your way home, okay? She smiled at me, but it was almost eerie how calm she was. Oh look, the sky's clearing up. I stepped out of the car, and the moment I did, I looked up at the sky. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were parting, revealing the moon. The full moon hung high in the night sky, casting its silver glow across the empty street. Tonight's a full moon, the teacher said, laughing. I didn't even realize. The weather forecast said it would be clear all night, but those sudden showers really threw me off. Her voice softened, and she stared at me, her smile never leaving her face. I guess you got lucky, Chris-sensei, she said with a grin, and drove off, waving at me through the window. I stood there in the quiet, the moonlight reflecting in the puddles around me. The air felt strangely heavy. It wasn't until I turned to head toward the station that I realized how much the conversation had unsettled me. What had I just heard? Could there really be truth in the old rumors about the school?
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.